This is going to be a great evening, and I can say that because I know each of the panel members from various experiences that we've shared over the last several years, and it's been an honor to work with these people, but also a great pleasure to work with them. All three of these guys are just great to interact with, and I know, as I'll try to explain, based on their different experiences and the wealth of experience that they have, that they've got a lot of insight to share with everybody, not just on the marine protected area experiences that they've had with the MLPA process, but with their perspectives on coastal and marine spatial planning as well. So the three individuals that we have here today this evening are David Crabbe, who's a commercial fisherman, Michael Weber, who is a policy analyst, and Mary Gleason, an ecologist with the Nature Conservancy. So I want to start and give you just a quick brief of the background of each of these individuals so that you'll appreciate the perspective that they have to share. So Dave's been a commercial fisherman in the California area for 30 years, right? And he stands out among commercial fishermen in two ways. First is his boyish complexion. I think if you were to try and really see Dave as a fisherman, you have to look at his hands, which even are miraculously intact given his extensive fishing background. And then the other aspect of his background is how extensive he's played a role in the development of fisheries policy here on the coast of California. For example, he's worked with various NGOs over his career. One with the Environmental Defense Organization to organize and facilitate a crab steering committee that developed fisheries policies for one of the most important fisheries on the coast of California. And this actually led to passage of a bill that required the crab fisheries to address some of the most long-standing contentious issues in that fishery. He's also been involved with other NGOs, including the Nature Conservancy and Environmental Defense. For example, with his work in Morro Bay, where they have been developing an unprecedented effort to spin up a community-based fisheries program that also, I think for one of the first times, involves individual quotas for fishers in that fishery as well, all of which are built around the goals of sustainable fisheries for that particular community. The other is his work, which I have known him from, as a seminal player in the stakeholders on the Central Coast portion of the Marine Life Protection Act initiative. And David was a key player as a voice for fishermen in the stakeholder process for the Marine Life Protection Act. And likewise, David and I have also participated in various working groups for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary as well. So his background in fisheries policy is extensive, and it's all culminated, at least to this point, with his appointment to the Pacific Fishery Management Council, which is the council that develops fisheries regulations for the West Coast. So now I want to turn quickly to Mary Gleason. Mary stands out among the members of the panel first by the one member who has actually been out to pick berries at the Ambling Ambystoma farm. And then secondly, as a marine ecologist, and I wanted to share this with many of the students, a marine ecologist with a PhD from Berkeley who has developed her career working with NGOs since she received her graduate training. She's been with the Nature Conservancy for 7 years. Has it only been 7 years? Really? Okay, I thought you were lying. As TNC's lead scientist for the California Coastal and Marine Program. And one of the things that she brings to bear as an ecologist is not just her marine ecology expertise, but she has extensive experience in various spatial modeling programs, tools, GIS-based tools that have become sort of a cornerstone of many of the marine spatial planning programs, both here and around the world. And so I hope that she'll share a lot of that experience and sort of the contribution of those tools to marine spatial planning. For the last 5 years, she's been on loan from TNC. It's kind of cool, they just loan people out, to the Marine Life Protection Act. And that's how I've worked with Mary quite a bit as well, in a role of the senior planner and a science advisor to all 4 regions of the state of California's Marine Life Protection Act. And then prior to coming to TNC, she was a consultant to government agencies in the US, Indonesia, and the Philippines on a variety of coastal management programs. So she has a sort of a broader experience than California alone. And then Michael Weber provides strategic advice and oversight for oceans, coasts, and fisheries programs. And I mean that broadly because if you learn of his background, that's what he does. He's Mr. Advice on all of that stuff that has to do with oceans and fisheries, including both the California Coastal and Marine Initiative and the Marine Life Protection Act initiative. And prior to his contributions here in California, he directed programs on marine protected areas, sea turtle conservation, fisheries conservation at the Center for Marine Conservation in Washington, D.C. So he actually brought sort of national level experience here to California. And he worked as a special assistant to the director of the National Marine Fisheries Service in the U.S. Department of Commerce. An early example of his work when he came to California was in what I would think is probably the hardest job that one could imagine, trying to explain the science of the Marine Life Management Act and the Marine Life Protection Act to the Fish and Game Commissioners. And as an advisor to the Fish and Game Commissioners, he essentially provided all the background necessary to understand those acts. The reason that he's so adept at providing such advice is because not only was he responsible for crafting the Marine Life Management Act, he wrote the book on it. And so if you are interested in understanding what is sort of the cornerstone, this is essentially the equivalent to the Magnuson-Stevens Act in the federal fisheries management. If you're interested, Michael has written this really nice synopsis of that California Marine Life Management Act. He's also written several other bestsellers. One of my favorite is From Abundance to Scarcity, A History of U.S. Marine Fisheries Policy, and several other books as well. Currently, he's a program director with the Resource Law Group, which is a nonprofit organization involved in natural resource conservation in California and the whole West Coast, and with specific interests in the marine environment. And they consult on land use and natural resource law and policy, and creating innovative ways that state agencies, federal agencies, and private foundations can interact with one another to facilitate policy development. So what I'm going to do is throw some questions at these poor bastards, and to get the discussion going, but in particular to give them an opportunity to share their background, both in the Marine Life Protection Act process, but more broadly in marine spatial planning. And then we're going to go through this probably relatively quickly, we'll see. And then we'll break for dinner and come back and then spend the rest of the evening receiving questions from you guys, okay? So hopefully these initial discussions will facilitate some questions from you. For logistics, before I go any further, through those big doors to the far left corner are the bathrooms. Okay, so just so everybody knows, and we don't have any accidents. So, Mike, is that working okay? Can you? I think that's just. So I think that's just for the video. So you have to broadcast your voice. Can you guys hear okay in the back? So you've played a seminal role in both the marine development of the Marine Life Management Act and the Marine Life Protection Act, both which have had sort of separate foci, one on fisheries management, the other on marine conservation in general. And can you briefly describe the intent of those two acts, first of all, to understand their distinctions and their purposes? And then I'd like you to talk about how you think coastal and marine spatial planning sort of contributes or adds to those particular efforts.
Well, I'll give it a try, Mark. And I wanted to thank Mark and Meg and Margaret for inviting me to participate this evening, and others on the organizing committee, to talk about some of the favorite stuff in my professional life, certainly. The Marine Life Management Act and the Marine Life Protection Act share something in common in that both of them really reflect a lot of the science and experience from the 1990s. The Marine Life Management Act was directed at really revolutionizing the management of fisheries in state waters in California, building on the experience with the Magnuson-Stevens Act at the federal level. And I would say that some of the primary features that were introduced were that there was a systematic science-based approach to the management of fisheries. And that was expressed largely through what's called a fishery management plan. And the federal government has had management plans since 1976. The Marine Life Management Act called for the management of fisheries by management plans. And that is in contrast to management of many fisheries in the state by the legislature. I can't imagine a greater contrast. And in the case with the legislature, these were management regulations that were pushed through largely driven by a relatively small group of people. And if you've ever been to a legislative committee hearing, you would know that you're not necessarily going to get all the facts on the table, all the perspectives, and a kind of a thoughtful searching evaluation of options. And so this was a very dramatic change. Another feature was that the Marine Life Management Act really tried to build authority for the stakeholders to be involved. And that fisheries management wasn't just a matter of the legislature or the Department of Fish and Game, which considered itself the expert. It was a much more complex sort of undertaking. I would have to say those provisions in the Act are probably the least implemented of all. And then the final piece that I would say is that the Marine Life Management Act really introduced ecosystems into the management of fisheries in California. And that is somewhat different from the Magnuson Act, because the Magnuson Act still really, I don't think, do that. But that is explicitly called out in the Marine Life Management Act. I would say it's been observed more in the breach. That is, it really hasn't been implemented. And then a real focus on sustainability. So now the Marine Life Management Act, I would say, is really reflected what I would say is a view of fisheries management and fisheries science. The Marine Life Protection Act reflected, I think, a very different point of view, which is the point of view of marine ecology. But it shared some common themes with the Marine Life Management Act. One is that it called for the development of a systematic science-based approach to marine protected areas. It was rather than ad hoc designation of MPAs, there were networks of MPAs. So that was quite a contrast. Once again, stakeholders, and in the Marine Life Protection Act, very clearly scientists were to be involved in the decision-making in a way that was really unprecedented for marine management, certainly in California. And then the Marine Life Protection Act really focused on biodiversity. It has fisheries aspects to it, but from my perspective, it's mostly about biodiversity conservation, something that it's very, very difficult for fisheries management to deliver, if not impossible. And then the other piece, and the real innovation of the Marine Life Protection Act, I would say, and it's relevant to what we're talking about this evening, is that it manages by space. It doesn't manage by species, it doesn't manage by activity, it manages space. And that goes against, I don't know, 4 or 5 centuries of tradition, going back to the Dutch lawyer Grotius. So this is a very, very dramatic break. As to what coastal and marine spatial planning can introduce, let me begin by saying I always put in front of it ecosystem-based coastal and marine spatial planning. Otherwise, you can end up with zones that have other purposes, perfectly fine purposes, but not what we're looking for. And what I would say is the primary enhancements are, I think you start thinking more about connections with other activities, other sectors. To me, ecosystem-based management, in a sense, can be reduced to a very simple rule: pay attention. And so this is really a matter of taking a broader view. Rather than just looking at water quality, you're looking at fisheries, you're looking at all the other activities in one piece. Also, I think it provides a structure for really explicitly weighing trade-offs. The way we use space inevitably involves trade-offs, and generally we don't think about them. So I think that's one potential. And then finally, cumulative impacts. Cumulative impact analysis has been in U.S. law since at least 1970, when the National Environmental Policy Act was adopted. I would say that it is probably one of the least effectively implemented provisions of law there is. And this provides some structure for starting to address cumulative impacts. So I think it's really on this broader level that I see, the clearest impacts right now.
So although you're not a policymaker per se, right, by title, you've had this profound effect on the development of marine policy in California. What do you think are the key challenges to implementing, developing and implementing marine spatial planning?
Well, I would say that the key challenges I see are inertia, an extraordinary challenge, and that is inertia of agencies, inertia of stakeholders, inertia of businesses. But I think that is a very, very significant challenge. I think another challenge is really the application of principles having to do with ecosystems and the human dimensions of coastal ecosystems. I think we're farther along when it comes to ecological principles than we are to principles on the human dimensions. Although any definition that you see about ecosystem-based management always mentions humans as being part of the ecosystem, I think that's kind of the last time they're mentioned in most discussions. So I think we have a ways to go there. And then I would say valuation. I was talking about trade-offs. I think there's a real big question as to whether or not valuation can actually be done. That is, can you measure and compare a barrel of oil against a barrel of ecosystem? And it may be that we can't, and we just need to find some other way of making sure that those concerns are front and center. But I think that those are, and I guess what I would say is that we could also make the perfect is the enemy of the good. I think the most important thing is to get started and to be very clear about what you're trying to do, and to adaptively manage, to keep looking back, learning, adapting. And that is tough for institutions to do.
So with respect to the sciences, you mentioned, for example, the importance of developing tools for valuing ecosystem services, trade-off tools, modeling systems. For these guys that are involved in graduate programs, be they the ecological, geological, social sciences, or economics, how do you, as a sort of a policy person, see the role of science, and what do you think are sort of the most important roles that science might have in contributing to the development of marine spatial planning?
Well, I think one of them is actually the role of scientists, and I think we may talk about this later. I think one of the most effective interactions or engagements of scientists in policy has been in the Marine Life Protection Act initiative. And, you know, to have scientists like yourself come up and talk to the Blue Ribbon Task Force members about what the principles are of for designing MPAs, and then to get back questions challenging what you just said, really, I think, led to a dialogue that was really, really productive. So I think part of it is just really engaging in the process. I think that there's a lot left to be understood about, you know, fairly basic features of coastal waters. But I guess my main recommendation, and to me where I see the biggest need and really the biggest opportunity, is the development of rules of thumb. And so a really excellent example of that is the development of guidelines for the design of marine protected areas. It wasn't that they have to be exactly this big and exactly this far apart. It was more, well, you know, here are some general rules, and if you come up with a design that follows these general rules, you're probably going to be more likely successful than not. I think that that's just a condition everywhere if we had rules like that. So one of my favorite examples is in fisheries. You know, we get stuck on fisheries assessments and status of populations and we won't manage until we've done that. But there are things that we can do just knowing the biology of some fish. So down where I live, there's a fish called the barred sand bass, and it's an aggregate spawner. And usually you would say, well, you know, that's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. So you really have to be careful. You don't want to fish, you know, all the spawning aggregations. But what's happened is that party boats have gone out. They found all the spawning aggregations. And so in the 1990s, they were catching 800,000 fish a year, and then it collapsed, and now it's down to 100,000 and less. And to me, I have to think, years ago, we could have just adopted this rule. We're not going to fish on all the spawning aggregations. So it's those sorts of things, just finding those insights that will tend to make decisions better and more robust. I think that there's similar things on watershed alterations. We tend to get into a box of having to assemble data and analyses before we're willing to make a decision. And we know that some things tend to be better for a watershed than other things. I think the big area that is to explore is this whole area of human dimensions. And I've really come to the view that it may not be a social science question. It may be the sort of question that you refer to the School of Social Welfare at Berkeley, where you're really dealing with people who analyze communities and how communities function. But the other piece, and I'll end with this, is applied economics. And what I mean by that is, once again, what are some rules of thumb? What tends towards producing good outcomes? And then I think economic histories of place, because we have a lot of information on how areas, communities all along the coast developed, and decisions that were made that have led to the situation that we're in now. I think we should go back and try to understand, what were the economic incentives and what can we learn from those decisions. So, but that's my prejudice as a historian. So.
Cool, thanks. So Mary, so you come to marine policy and specifically marine spatial planning from an ecologist perspective, but you also bring this really strong understanding and experience with mapping tools and spatial modeling tools. So can you first tell us about how you kind of got sucked into the MLPA process, and then your perspective on sort of the contribution of those tools to that process?
Sure, yeah. I mean, my background in marine ecology, I decided to focus on applied questions, and so a lot of the early work I did was as a consultant for various government agencies, really looking at essentially spatial planning issues in Indonesia and the Philippines, MPA siting or industry siting or what have you, but essentially spatial decisions. So I had a lot of experience in that regard. And then when I started working for the Nature Conservancy, I started, as TNC does, with an eco-regional scale assessment of the marine ecosystems off California, just looking region-wide, where are the areas of biodiversity importance, and doing a whole mapping exercise, compiling data, using Marksan software to sort of identify priority areas for biodiversity. And then essentially, TNC at that point, we had compiled more spatial data than any other organization or agency in California. So when the MLPA process started, we offered up that data and then my expertise as a planner just to assist the process. And I think that's, one thing I enjoy about working for TNC is just that sort of role that TNC often tends to play in terms of just trying to support good decision making, good processes. And so, rather than taking any sort of advocacy role in the process or sort of looking for any specific outcome, we just decided to engage in the process and in supporting the process. So I was brought on as a planning advisor, science advisor, and my role was to help bring the data forward, work with the stakeholders, the science advisory team, the task force, to be able to visualize that data and use that data to inform the MPA designs. And so in that process, early on, we realized that sort of the classic just sort of GIS analysis approach wasn't going to work. In fact, that's how we started in the Central Coast. It was a very sort of rapid startup, a 7-month process, which was, in hindsight, way too short, probably. But essentially, we had a few GIS staff, and we were just trying to grind through all of the mapping needs, all the analytical needs, and it wasn't going to work because the process was so fast-paced, and the process was really designed to give the stakeholders the power to make the designs. And so they had to be able to see all the data and incorporate the science guidelines and figure out how to design these networks of MPAs. And so very quickly, we realized that, this great concept of MLPA and of stakeholder empowerment didn't have the sort of tools it needed to move forward. And so then we engaged in a process, and in the Central Coast first region, we had a very early beta version of a tool that sort of arrived at the end of the process, not near enough in time. And through the next region in the North Central Coast, we sort of evolved that further. And finally, I think by the South Coast process, which was the third region, we had developed Marine Map. And that actually was a very functional tool. I think it got very high remarks and regard from the stakeholders and the SAD and the decision makers in terms of being a useful tool for the process, because it actually could help them. It was fast, it was live online, they could work individually, look at all the data layers, or they could work in groups. They could do the analyses that the SAT was essentially going to be doing, and it was all centralized so that the stakeholders and the evaluations by the science team were all based on the same database. So everything was centralized and fast. You could use it real time in meetings. So it was really an effective tool, but it was an incredible investment financially and just in terms of developer brain power to bring those right ingredients to bear. But I think, in hindsight, what I've learned is that, a lot of these great policy concepts of, how to do better, ecosystem-based management, how to think about cumulative impacts, valuation. The concepts are out there, in front, and very often the data that you need to do that work or the tools that you need to do those analyses sort of come after the fact, and it takes time to develop them, and it's very hard, when you're just launching some kind of stakeholder process or public policy process to, have the tools ready-made. And so, in my view, it was by the third of 4 regions in the MLP we finally got the right tool. And it was great for the North Coast. And so now we have a tool, and that tool could be, modified and used in other spatial planning processes. But, the key is to really figure out what you need the tools to do, what's the minimum data that you need, and what are those functions that the tool has to perform. And so one thing I'm interested in is just in this whole push for CMSP, what are the tool needs, what are the questions we're trying to answer, and we need to sort of figure out that the science guidelines, the rules of thumb, or sort of what's driving the process before you can bring the right set of tools together.
One aspect of that, from that experience with the MLPA process, is the role that those mapping tools played in sort of getting the stakeholders engaged and empowered. And I think that had quite an important impact on the success of that process. How do you see that? I mean, do you have any ideas how you see that facilitating marine spatial planning more broadly?
Yeah, I think that was one of the key functions of Marine Map as it evolved, was to bring all of that centralized data and make it accessible to people so they could really use it and interact with it, and get some buy-in on sort of what those important data layers were. So I think it represents a good model for that for CMSP moving forward. Definitely would need more development in terms of different kinds of data for different sort of cumulative impacts or different kinds of planning uses that you're going to address. But I think in terms of a tool and sort of a way to engage the stakeholders, it was very effective. And it certainly requires some level of technical ability. I mean, we had to have people who were computer savvy. But it was pretty user friendly and web accessible, and it allowed them to sort of create their designs and think about designs sort of privately in little groups, and then they could share them more broadly with the public or with the process at large. So I think that was another thing that folks really reacted positively to, is they could use the tool sort of, in the privacy of their own home and come up with their own ideas and think about them and evaluate them before they shared them more broadly. So it wasn't just a tool that was out there in the public, but it was that too.
So one question I had for you was your perspective on scientists as advisors as opposed to stakeholders. But I'd actually like to wait, and maybe we can do that after dinner, because it'd be neat to get everybody's perspective on that, in fact, how you perceive the role of scientists in these processes. So if we can turn to Dave. So, so you played a really prominent role as a stakeholder in the Central Coast process, especially of the MLPA initiative. And like Michael sort of alluded to when he was introducing or summarizing the MLPA, it had a couple of features that I think kind of caught the fishing community by surprise. The first one is this idea that here's a place that you will never fish in again for the rest of your life. And there's been spatial approaches to fisheries management before, but nothing of that radical per se, right? The other is that the argument was that fish provide a wide variety of ecosystem services, all of which need to be valued beyond simply catching them and providing them as a source of food. And so those are sort of two perspectives that I think emerged through the MLPA process. How do you think the fishing community felt about that? And you can, either the fishing community or yourself personally, and how has your perspective changed through time?
As fishermen, and I think Mike touched on that, many years of cultural fishing and what people went through as a businessman and as a commercial fisherman. It was more about figuring out ways to harvest fish, where to find fish, where to go. And so that was sort of the mindset of most fishermen. The challenge was selling them, catching them, keeping your boat running. That was kind of what went through your thinking process as a business. And there were regulations, but there were regulations more along the lines of quotas and maybe gear type and that type. But to all of a sudden run into the MLPA process where they were talking about access, and that obviously was a culture shock for a lot of guys in business. There were areas where people would fish and had built their business around fishing in those areas for many years. and to face the possibility of losing that area, they immediately were ready to, sign off and say that that's going to put me out of business. And in some cases it did. There were some fishermen that were put out of business through this process. So that took some time to work through the process and try to look for some positives through some area closures. Your other question about, what was the second part of that again, Mark? It was...
I don't have any idea at this point.
Oh.
Just kidding.
I could look here and figure it out.
It's how they responded not just to creating spatial closures, but also thinking about fish as this service, this ecosystem resource that has more value than simply fishing.
Yeah, and that's also something that takes time. I think a lot of fishermen, they see the resources as something that comes back cyclically. It cycles, and they know that there's high seasons and high years, high productive years, and low productive years. And I'm not sure that most of them grasped that the benefit of, or they didn't see what they were taking as a major impact. Mm-hmm. They thought that other fishery regulations were protecting against biodiversity impacts. Mm-hmm. And that was, that I think is still a question that probably a lot of fishermen have. And I mean, you're sort of getting at the need of MPAs. And that was a big question. I'm sure everybody's heard that several times, is what is the need for an MPA and why? And I think the fishermen were much more comfortable, or I know I was personally, with the benefit to the nearshore MPAs versus the offshore MPAs, where there's highly migratory species or species that did not necessarily live in that MPA or stay in that MPA for a long period of time. And so it was, and it continues to be a learning process. I think the other thing that the entire coast is dealing with is these are new. They're new, and there's been a lot of perceived benefits to the process, and I think it's going to take time. And I do think I think that there's a lot of fishermen that believe that there can be some benefits to this. It's just when are they going to start to show up? And I mean, I don't know if Mike spoke to this, but it seems like there's going to be 5 years before you can tell if there is any improvement. And so that's what, the fishermen were trying to, look at the bright side. I know that some of the discussions were about certain fishing areas and maybe taking a portion of that fishing area. So the idea that there might be spillover and there would be benefit in the long run. But that's going to take time. And so that's what I think the bright side and the fishermen have look forward to, hopefully.
So does, I don't know to what extent the fishing community has been exposed or introduced to coastal and marine spatial planning, but given that they've had this now 6-year experience with creating these marine protected areas, do you have any idea whether they perceive marine spatial planning as providing some benefits to them, or is it yet just another spatial way of restricting their activities?
The first, I'm sure, and speaking to a few fishermen about this, I know the first impact is, here we go again. Yeah. I think that there are some benefits there, but they're going to have to learn to trust the process first before they can get into what the benefits are. I mean, Mark, you and I were having the conversation earlier about one of the big comments during the MLPA process were outside impacts to the ecosystem and to the biodiversity, river runoff and pollution, cruise ships dumping, that type of thing. So I do think that there was no way to get an answer to that. It didn't really fit into the MLPA process. So this is an opportunity to maybe answer some of those questions about, or have those impacts be at the table where they weren't there before. So But I know that the first reaction is going to be, uh-oh. So that'll be, but as you dig into it, and all of a sudden there's going to be some of the answers to the questions that there weren't answers to during the MLPA process, I think that'll turn some lights on.
Cool. So I think we're pretty much out of time for this initial dialogue. So if you have a question, if you'll please raise your hand or something, I'll point you out. And there you go, right there. And then please, when you jump up, just give your name and the institution that you're from, and then nail these guys.
Mark, can you repeat the question for the benefit of...
Okay, and I'll try. I'm the communicator for the video system, so I'll try and repeat your question.
I'm Mark Kowalski from CSUMB. I'm actually on the watershed side of our program, and I'm interested in knowing your thoughts about incorporating watershed policy, watershed management into the NPA, since it's based on ecosystem-based approach. Would it make sense to include that process as well, looking at the terrestrial input into the ocean, and how would we go about it, or what steps would need to happen to make that happen?
Yeah, the question is, what role might incorporation of watershed management into MPAs, marine protected areas and marine spatial planning have, and if there is a role to incorporate that watershed perspective, how might it be done?
Well, I know that issue came up in the first phase of the MLPA initiative, and in the master plan framework, which was kind of a how-to design MPAs in California, there were provisions that made it, suggested that the Blue Ribbon Task Force, when it made its recommendations about marine protected areas, could also make recommendations to agencies such as those like Regional Water Quality Control Board or whatnot, regarding impacts from activities, potential impacts on MPAs. So it's kind of a soft version of how you would do that, but still the avenue's there. I know that down on the South Coast where I live, and I think elsewhere, a lot of the MPAs overlap with areas of special biological significance. And so I think you're going to see more coordination on monitoring those areas, certainly. But I think, I guess I would look at it more in terms of a specific marine protected area and watershed, and really start from there. I mean, you know, people have been talking about the linkage between land and sea for 50 years and how important it is, and we've got to do something about it. Our laws, our institutions, our organizations are all organized to be landside or waterside. And so it's a huge hurdle, but I think with marine protected areas, you have a focus for really addressing that linkage. I think on the central coast of Steelhead, for instance. And so I think that there are linkages there to be made, but it's not as if, you know, the Marine Life Protection Act by itself can really make anything happen.
You know, I'll add quickly to that. At the last Science Advisory Team meeting, Dominic Gregorio, who is with the State Water Control Board, announced that that board recently passed regulations to limit all future discharges into the marine protected areas created by the MLPA. Next question. Your name and your institution, please.
My name is Beth, and I'm from CSU Monterey Bay. And in the Journal Club, we were talking about how California probably has less potential user conflicts than other states or other regions, especially with industry. So my question is a devil's advocate question: why do we need marine spatial planning in California?
Right, so the question is, in California, where there appears to be not a lot of conflict, user conflict as much as other parts of the country, do we really need marine spatial planning?
Well, I'll wade into that.
I'm glad I just answered. I just
yes.
passed on the question.
So let me try this out. So you're absolutely right. We don't have kind of the pressing issues, let's say, that they had in Massachusetts with a wind farm that upset people on Cape Cod. And really, if you would need dozens and dozens of wind farms off California to raise that much of a ruckus, I think. So we don't have that kind of really kind of banner issue. But I think that there are some aspects that are really worth considering within this ecosystem-based marine spatial planning. And before I get kind of the formal legal framework for it, there's a whole area of coordination among agencies in terms of the information they share, getting that information into geospatial formats, making it available to people. I mean, right now, there are agencies that are relying on, paper records of permits that, they themselves issued in considering other permits, but they have no idea what the other agencies have. They don't have necessarily an idea of what habitats are out there. And the potential now is as a result, I would say, really of the MLPA, where there's a lot of information that's been collected, seafloor mapping, surface currents, a lot of information on human activities, that we can really start looking at and seeing where there are overlaps between activities and things that we care about. And right now, I would say we're at a very high risk of unintentional damage because we allow activities in areas and we really, the permitting authority really doesn't know what's there. So that is kind of a fairly low-level piece of it. The other piece of it, I would say, is that as I said, the ecosystem-based piece of it, I think, is really important. And there, I think, principles that guide the decision-making that will deliver, ecosystem integrity and other measures of ecosystem health are things that are kind of mentioned in various laws. So to me, it's a matter of providing the information and principles that could actually start moving us towards a more holistic approach to management. Now, eventually you can get to things like zoning and those sorts of area designations. But I would say that one thing that the MLPA initiative really demonstrated to me is the power of the spatial display of information. And I don't think there was anyone who was involved, particularly on the South Coast or the North Coast, in designing MPAs who didn't come away with a totally different sense of the waters off their shores, first of all, and of the ability to really start thinking about how do you manage activities spatially. So I think that there's just a huge potential there. But you're right, it isn't, and I guess as somebody who works with state government a lot, there are going to be continuing budget cuts, staff cuts, and agencies are just going to have to be more organized, more coordinated, and savvier about how they use information and how they actually make decisions. And so I think that this kind of suite of activities that people collect under marine spatial planning is really a key to that. And although we may not have wind farms, we got an enormous budget problem. And so we've got to be a whole lot smarter about how we do our business.
Something I could add to that also is, specifically from industry, there's, a conflict up north with crab fishermen and wave energy, alternative energy. And so they're looking, I know from industry's perspective, they're wondering, are we going to have a say on where this wave energy is going to be placed? And there's not, that forum has not been defined yet. And so I think they may, once they get over the initial, is this going to be another wave of MPAs? Or is this also a chance to weigh in on where these wave energy is going to be placed won't hinder our crab industry?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of planning decisions being made, and I think a good example is in the coastal zone, and getting back to the first question about the terrestrial watersheds and the land-sea interface. I mean, California led on the MLPA and sort of thinking through the concepts and how to apply it and how to develop the tools and the data. I think, we have the same opportunity to take what we've done and sort of take the next steps in the next frontier, which I think is going to be the land-sea connectivity issues. And there's decisions made, every day by the Coastal Commission and other agencies that would benefit from a more comprehensive approach to how they think about it, how they collaborate with the other agencies. And, I think we're at a point now where we have a lot of the stakeholder buy-in and the stakeholder sort of capacity built up so they understand how to use some of these data and tools and can make better decisions and inform better decisions.
Could I just add one thing? That we don't have wind farms, but I live about 15 miles from one of the largest ports in the world, the Port of Los Angeles. And the Port of Los Angeles is going to continue growing. And there's going to be a lot more vessel traffic. There's discussion now about creating a kind of vessel highway off the California coast as a measure to address greenhouse gases associated with transporting goods. And so in areas like that, where you have a lot of different activities, you're going to have conflicts, and you're going to be making choices over areas that you want to protect and maintain and other areas that you're going to be using for other purposes. And right now, the decision is kind of the Port of LA. There are a lot of other people who should be engaged in that, and a better sense of regionally what the plan is. So there are parts, I would say, of California where we can use these sorts of tools.
Another question?
My name is Mike Pathenquist, and I work for the National Capital Project at Stanford. And this is sort of a follow-up to the first question on what you guys did. But I'm just curious, in the MLPA process, what kind, somebody mentioned, you mentioned earlier the importance of evaluating trade-offs. And I'm wondering, in this process thus far, are there particular kinds of classes or types of trade-offs that you keep seeing again and again? And how have you evaluated or attempted to evaluate those trade-offs thus far? And they kind of been just sort of looking at things on a map, and what kinds of data have you either had to go out and collect, or you've identified as sort of what you would need someday to collect in order to get those kinds of trade-offs, whether they be economic or other kinds?
Yeah, I'll start just from what we did in the MLPA. I mean, it was essentially looking at fishing interests versus sort of conservation ecosystem protection. And so the trade-offs were, evaluated informally by all the stakeholders in their negotiations and in their knowledge. And then really the only formal way they were evaluated was by a very sort of crude approach of looking at fishing income and fishing areas that would be lost if MPAs were established. And so it was a worst case scenario, and it was not very precise, but it was sort of gave a relative measure among the various proposals which one might cause the most harm to the fishery. So it was pretty crude. It wasn't satisfying to anyone. I think if there's any kind of data the MLPA could have benefited from, it would be more socioeconomic data. And then looking at, we didn't really specifically evaluate many other types of issues or uses unless they sort of came up as a conflict with proposed MPAs. There could have been a much more formal evaluation of some of the other sort of trade-offs or downsides of some of the designs. So there's a lot, we could do to improve that.
Hi, I'm Julie. I'm from Hopkins Marine Station. And we were talking a little bit about the role of science in this whole process, but also about the role of scientists. And apart from the scientific advisory board, whether scientists could be stakeholders and actually have a say on that level. So I just want to see what you thought about that.
Okay, now just wait a minute. I have to repeat the question. Very cool question. The question is the role of scientists in these processes and whether their role should be considered as yet another stakeholder in the process. Okay.
So I think sort of my answer to that is sort of yes and no. I mean, we certainly had stakeholder members who were officially part of the regional stakeholder group who were scientists. John Pierce, retired from Santa Cruz, was one example. He was there advocating for the places that he knew and loved, and he bringing a lot of his local knowledge in the same way that the fishermen brought their local knowledge about these areas. So, he was playing, an advocacy role. He was there to represent, scientific interests, research interests, knowledge about conservation value. And then, other folks like, Mark was there on the science advisory team in a more objective role to provide the best available science, provide guidance and advice. I was there in a very much a neutral role, not as a conservationist from TNC, but just as a scientist and planner to provide technical advice and support. And so I think, scientists can play either role, either as stakeholders with sort of an advocacy role or a more objective sort of providing scientific input role. I think the danger you get into is if you try to play both. And so you have to sort of go in, with one hat on and keep that hat on and not try to have both.
Good point. Look, there's a whole bunch of you now. Go ahead. Yep.
Hello, my name is Edith Donovan from Stanford, and I was wondering what is the potential and challenges to implement adaptive management within the MLP legal framework? So yeah, I mean, because should I repeat?
No, I got it. Is that it?
That's it.
So the question is, what is the potential in the legal framework and the challenges for adaptive management?
For adaptive management to be implemented from a legal standpoint.
I was going to say that. Yeah. So the question is, what's the potential, what are the challenges for adaptive management in a legal framework in the MLPA process, in general? Yeah. Go ahead, just try that.
Well, first of all, the Marine Life Protection Act specifically mentions adaptive management and defines it, and it shares that with the Marine Life Management Act. That said, I'm not sure that the drafters knew how that would be done. But it was one of those phrases that were floating around in the 90s as something really good and you should do it. But I think the Marine Life Protection Act itself, the initiative as it's moved forward, has demonstrated one way of doing it. The initiative adapted region to region to region. And very simply by means of looking back at what had been learned in a previous region and adapting that to a new region. In terms of the main mechanism for adaptive management of the statewide network, monitoring is going to be playing a key role. And so the MPA monitoring enterprise, which is at the Ocean Science Trust, has the lead on developing monitoring plans for the state. And so there's a plan for the Central Coast, a plan for the North Central Coast. They're developing one on the South Coast. And that really is one of the challenges of that is distilling a few testable questions that can tell you how the MPAs are performing and what their impact is, and what we can learn about the design of the MPAs as a network to begin with. And so based on that, the idea is that there will be regular reviews of networks of marine protected areas, and an opportunity for adjustment of boundaries or regulations. But I think, as someone mentioned a little earlier, if we start seeing changes in 10 years, I think it'll be remarkable because a lot of these systems just aren't going to change that quickly. So I think the basics are there for adaptive management, but it is very much a work in progress. We at Resources Law Group had a lot of research done on how other systems of protecting ecosystems conducted monitoring and adaptively managed. And there was really no model to depend upon. So this is really a work in progress. And but I think that's, I don't know if that responds to your question, but it is very much a part of the future for the MLPA.
Yeah, I'm interested. I'm Zach Brown from Stanford. I'd be interested in hearing some more about sort of the key biological or ecological issues that are at the forefront in deciding where these marine protected areas should be. They're marine mammal rookeries or seabird colonies or spawning grounds for a threatened fish species or something like this. What are the key issues that you hone in on to say we need a marine protected area right here in science?
So the question was, what were some of the key ecological and biological considerations that were incorporated into the design of the MLPA networks?
Okay, I can start, and then maybe you want to speak to what you actually used as a stakeholder. But essentially, the science guidelines, set forward some ideas of representation of all habitat types, replication of each habitat type, some minimum habitat areas to protect to sort of qualify as representation, size and spacing that was based on adult movement patterns of fish and larval dispersal distances. So there were a set of guidelines. And so it was very sort of habitat focused and sort of spacing focused to ensure connectivity. And so the stakeholders started there, and we had the maps and the decision support tools showed them where all of those habitats were and how they were distributed. They got additional guidance from the science advisory team about subregions or bioregions within a planning region. So they had a lot of guidance about sort of how to build a network. And then, really there's a lot of different ways to put that together, a lot of different choices you can make. And that's where they really went through a negotiated process of thinking about what are some of the impacts on fisheries and ports, and how do we want to, protect places that, we value as important for conservation. So there was a variety of sort of parameters that went into what was essentially a negotiated solution. But it included, primarily habitats, special features, special places, things like breeding bird habitats and marine mammal rookeries were sort of considered a bit separately in a special closures process, which we can talk more about, but essentially a variety of ecological parameters that were then balanced against primarily the fishing interests. And then, David, I don't know if you want to...
just to follow up on that, is the guidelines were sort of our bar to meet, so to speak, and we had to balance the socioeconomic. So basically, is what we did in the Central Coast was the consumptive users of the fishery sort of came together and kind of had to. That's where the give and take really came, of trying to balance the impacts to each industry, but still meet the guidelines. So it was a long, lots of meetings, small groups, trying to find out where the least amount of impacts, but still get the best net gain where the guidelines directed us. So the fishermen's, the consumptive proposal that came out of the Central Coast was termed maybe the least protective, but it did meet the minimum guidelines. And so it probably had the least amount of socioeconomic impacts. And so that was the balance that we worked towards.
You know, I should mention that the most of those biological and ecological considerations and how they were incorporated into the design guidelines are laid out in a document called the Master Plan Framework. And there's a boatload of documents that are available at the MLPA website that you can pull down and get more background on.
My name is Alan. I'm from the Meyer Institute for National Studies, and I was interested in learning more about the conflict between confidentiality and transparency. As we know, fishermen, they're very particular about where they fish. Energy plants are going to be put in very particular places where they spend millions of dollars to do their research and identify these spots. How do you ensure that they give you that information, allowing that to be transparent, and at the same time making sure that other people aren't getting access to these places that they are investing a lot of money in?
Yeah, so the question was, how did the process deal with this inherent conflict between transparency and confidentiality of some of the information that was provided, especially by the stakeholders?
Let me start. All right.
Yeah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so essentially, you know, that process evolved through each of the 4 regions. I think we got better at that over time. But the essential idea was, you know, initially in compiling the spatial data for a region, you know, the ecological, biological data was mostly available through various agencies or NGOs or different groups that would make it available, and it was generally publicly available data anyway. You know, the real challenge was collecting the fisheries information from the fishermen, and that was done through contract with an organization called EcoTrust, based up in Portland. And they did confidential interviews and surveys with the fishermen on the areas of greatest importance to them for their various fisheries. That was mapped, you know, individually by fishermen, but then was aggregated into sort of aggregate data layers, which were then visible to the stakeholders in their negotiations. So it was only information that the fishermen were willing to share and have in an aggregated form that was made available in Marine Map or in the decision support tool to the stakeholders. And there was definitely, you know, a lot learned along that way. I think in the first region, I think it's safe to say the fishermen were, you know, probably a little bit less willing to give up that information and share it, you know, not as trustful in the process. I think we gained their trust over time in improving that information, but it's still not perfect information. And, you know, it was something that was treated very confidentially. I mean, it's not publicly available. It's held by the Department of Fish and Game, and is only sort of viewable in an aggregate form.
You know, that was a huge issue for industry's perspective. They were very concerned about how that information would be used. Industry came from a position of, you know, we can't give them the information, it'll be used against us. And we were, you know, I was in the Central Coast process, which was the first process, which Mary spoke to as being where the least amount of trust was. And we did do the interviews, and I participated in the interviews with EcoTrust, and I would say transparency was an issue from my standpoint of the process, and that may be an area that I think at least maybe later on, was improved, but exactly how the information that we were given was going to be disseminated and used into the process was a big question, because I think a lot of fishermen actually, when they were giving their information, I think they tended to think that without knowing the methodology and the results and how it was going to be used, they tended to think, well, shoot, you know, I need to paint with a broad brush here, because I want to make sure that my area is known to be an area of importance to me. When in fact, painting with a broad brush actually diluted the end result, but industry wasn't aware of that during that process. So that was a big concern, and I think the one way to get around it is to make sure there's good clarity on the methodology of the model.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Max Sargent from UCSC. I was wondering, when you have the criteria for the areas and you're able to identify these sort of priority areas for conservation, did that tend to greatly overlap with where the fishermen thought the most productive areas were? Was there a lot of, just sort of conflict, and did the fishermen feel that they were targeting these great fishing areas, or was there not as much overlap with this criteria?
Yeah, the question is, how often was there conflict between the areas that were identified as conservation priority with the areas that were of special interest to the fishing industry, community?
I can speak to yes, quite regularly. There was conflict with high productive areas and also high areas of biodiversity. And that, that was a big concern, because obviously if you close off all of the high production areas, then there's no areas to go. And there was always this spillover talk of, well, if you protect these high production, there'll be spillover. But from the stakeholders' position, there was concern that, there's a reason that those are high productive areas. And when you talk about spillover, as long as there's other similar type habitats for that species to spill over to that is open to fishing, then you can gain some of that benefit. But if you're talking about a rock cropping where there's high productivity and the spillover is into sand, you don't find any spillover, and so there would not be any benefit, at least to the fishing industry, from that. So there was a lot of that's another place where there was a lot of negotiating and give and take and work to create spaces where the highest return from biodiversity and the least socioeconomic impact.
Taking a look at some of these questions, particularly the process from more of a social science perspective, with an eye to improving the process from the individual stakeholder group's perspective. Could you individually, as representatives of the various interests, define what it means to be heard as a representative of your various interests within the context of the overall process?
Yeah, the question is if the stakeholders can define what it means to be heard in this process. That's pretty much you, Dave.
Yeah. No, there was no doubt that fishermen had uncertainty about that. They railroad job was used quite often. So I think that was real difficult for the process to get confidence in the industry that this was clear and transparent. So how to do a better job to achieve that, it's difficult. I almost think it takes time after the process to sort of have the results prove out to achieve that. I'm not sure if there's any quick and easy route to have industry comfortable with a process like this, that it's clear and transparent out of the chute. So that's a good question, and it's a tough one to answer. There may be some ideas. I don't know if you guys have some in the future processes, if you felt like there were some things that gained industry's confidence that their voices were being heard. A quick example, I know there was a sort of a lessons learned after the first process in Central California, and I know from industry's position after going through the process, their recommendation was to eliminate the Blue Ribbon Task Force. And because the process was set up to where it would go through the Blue Ribbon Task Force and then the Department of Fish and Game, and the department participated in the process, and I think they understood a lot of the issues very well. So the industry felt like, hey, the department was a good person to work with through this process. The end result was they got rid of the department and kept the Blue Ribbon Task Force. So industry questioned about how much they were being heard.
I think if I could just add, one technique that I look back on and wonder whether it might make a difference is just in terms of collecting information, particularly about fishing, that perhaps more could be gained by one-on-one interviews, small group interviews, trying to portray what a fishery is and how it operates. And I think even with a process that I think was well facilitated in many respects, after a certain point, if you get 60 people in a room, the nature of the conversation changes. And I've always wondered whether or not in putting together what was called the regional profile, some fairly basic interviewing techniques might have been helpful, because, as you say, I think it's very important for people to see their view represented, and there some techniques were used in the MLPA initiative. I think there are other techniques that might be worth using in the future.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think we relied mostly on sort of the one-on-one conversation or the small group conversations among the stakeholders to sort of get that out, like how a fishery operates, where the important places were, and not try to put something formalized in a document that you have to sort of get buy-in on, because that I think would be pretty hard. But if you're relying on an informal process of just sort of negotiation and discussion, it's not apparent that everything is going to come surface to that conversation.
I'd like to insert a question, if I can, that pertains to these last two, which is whether there was some kind of means of knowledge transfer that developed within stakeholder groups from one region to the next. So in other words, did the Central Coast fishermen tell the North Central guys, this is how we got screwed, or this is what you're going to have to think about, how to deal with the system?
In the Central Coast process is what the consumptive stakeholders did was try to form a coalition amongst themselves and really work together as a group. The biggest fear from the consumptive stakeholders is if they started to fight amongst themselves and pit each other against, fight more for my fishery than your fishery. And that was something that it was really important to, I think, look at it as a whole, not just for the industry, but also for the whole process. And I think it benefited the process that we worked that way, and that was something that we tried to convey to other groups, that you really need to try to work together and not work as individuals, because then it really gets messy.
To piggyback on that, were there instances, my name is Kate, I'm from UCSC. Piggyback on that, were there instances where the conservationists and the industry interests were not reconcilable at that particular spatial spot? And how did the process sort of carry you through these patches where maybe there, even though the process was more collaborative, parts of the results couldn't be?
Just really quickly, the question was, were there irreconcilable differences among stakeholders?
Yeah, and how did the collaborative process sort of ease that, or still were there the sticking points between these groups that at some points the interests weren't reconcilable?
And that's a good question, and is what happened in the Central Coast is we sort of broke into factions. It was a little bit like Survivor. You had this group over here and this group over this group, and is what ended up happening. If I remember right, I think we had three proposals on the table, three networks of marine reserves, and they all met the guidelines at various levels, some higher and some lower. And as what happened was then those three proposals were brought to the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and they had to make some of the tougher decisions. They could pick either one of the proposals or create one of their own. So that was, and did that satisfy industry on the compromise? I would say that, industry's position was, we met the guidelines, it has the least socioeconomic impact, so any adjustment to that is unnecessary. So I think it was a hard decision, because the Blue Ribbon Task Force was trying to balance the conservation community, industry, and then the consumptive industry community, and trying to find some middle ground there. So, but that was, if you guys could probably correct me if I misspoke there at all.
Essentially, the first three regions, we ended up with, three alternatives essentially, and then the push was never for the stakeholder group to come to a unanimous agreement, because we felt like that would be too hard. In the North Coast, they did do that and ended up with one proposal. But in each of the other regions, I mean, essentially that was the role of the task force, was to sort of resolve those differences. And I think that was one of the beauties of the design, and having that task force in that role as opposed to the Fish and Game Commission or whoever else, really just sort of this body that was convened specifically to sort of listen to all of that testimony and spend all of that time with the stakeholders and the scientists to really understand the issues in a way that the Fish and Game Commission doesn't have time to sort of get into that level of depth of understanding of the issues. And so, you know, in theory, their decision would be well informed.
If I could just add on that, I think it is really important to understand that the initiative, which is this non-regulatory process that feeds into the regulatory process, was able to do things that never happen in the formal regulatory process. If you go to a Fish and Game Commission meeting, it's not too much to say that it often gets very ritualistic. And there's not a lot of discussion and so on and so forth for a variety of reasons. And one of the ideas was to make sure that there was really a robust discussion among stakeholders about what alternatives there were. But importantly, the learnings that we took away from what happened at the Channel Islands included that it's probably best not to try to get a group of stakeholders to come to consensus. Because what happened at the Channel Islands is that there was one very well-developed proposal. And then there was a fisherman's proposal that was not very well-developed. And I think there was one other proposal. And so what was presented to the commission, the ultimate decision makers, was one very well-developed proposal and two marginally developed proposals. And it was our feeling that the commission is the ultimate decision maker. It's not a regional stakeholder group. It's not the Blue Ribbon Task Force. It is the Fish and Game Commission. And that the best thing to do for decision makers is to provide them with alternatives that have been developed, fully vetted, and represent the interests and the understanding of people in the region. It's really their job to weigh the final balance. So it's really at the core of the design of the initiative was that it was trying to seek realistic and real alternatives, not a final solution, so to speak.
My name is Todd from CSU Monterey Bay, and kind of continuing a little bit with this line of discussion. A lot of this revolves around stakeholders that are already in the process and already engaged to some extent. When you talk about coastal marine spatial planning, you're dealing with more users, more potential conflicts, and users that may be more well-funded, more organized in order to actually oppose the process entirely. I don't know if that examples of that came out in the South Coast or not, but what's the kind of carrot to bring people to that process or to the table when you're dealing with really big interest, bigger than potentially fishing or conservation? Those two groups.
So the question was, how do you create a stakeholder process, a broader stakeholder process for marine spatial planning that may involve great inequities among the stakeholders in, say, financial resources?
I think that's a really good question. And it is kind of one of the limitations of thinking about the MLPA as a model for marine spatial planning. My wife is on the State Water Resources Control Board, and I'm always amazed at how water agencies are able to send highly trained people to meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. I mean, they really invest in participating. And there just isn't that bandwidth, so to speak, for fishing industry or other interests. I think the way I think of it, though, is that marine spatial planning can provide benefits to a wide range of interests, whether they're large or small. And I think a lot of it has to do with, as I said earlier, pooling information that otherwise they are going to have to go out and assemble. And also providing a clearer idea of what the planning environment is right now. So right now, for instance, at one basic level of marine spatial planning, you would be able to identify areas that are quite vulnerable to certain kinds of activities. Well, it's much better to know that in advance of starting some development plan than as it is now, finding out about it after you've, say, filed for your permit and you start doing research. So I think of it more in terms of inducements. I think it's unlikely that anytime soon we will have laws that will compel somebody to sit at the table. But one of the other things I would say is that once you make the process transparent and make the information transparent, in a sense, it doesn't matter how much money you've got. It really, I think the information can be a great leveler. So, but it isn't as if you're going to compel them to sit down.
You know, we have a saying I hear a lot at the council, and it's, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you have to show up to make sure that your interests are represented.
So it's 8:30, so we really only have time for one more question.
Amanda, Stanford. Earlier, when we were talking about tools, you had on the one hand the idea of the great importance of these and the ramp-up time, and then on the other hand, talking about resource constraints and state budget cuts. And so my question is, how do you reconcile this? Where is this needed investment going to come from? What kind of partnerships? What kind of, just how is that going to be done?
Right, so the question was, given the financial costs, the expense of these efforts, how do you generate this resources to actually do these processes effectively?
I would just start by saying, I mean, I think in California, we're actually ahead of the curve there relative to other states because we have a marine map type tool. We have a lot of the spatial data compiled. We've mapped a lot of our state waters. So we're way ahead of the game versus some other states. But at the same time, I mean, we're really fiscally strapped. And so it's still going to take a significant investment to sort of package all that up and make it available to a, you know, multi-objective sort of MSP type process. And so I think we're a long way from that.
And I think it is an area where the kind of public-private partnership that really was the foundation for the Marine Life Protection Act initiative offers a potential model as well, because there is an interest, certainly I think in the foundation community, in advancing this. And I think we've got, through Ocean Science Trust and institutions like that, the science advisory team of the Ocean Protection Council, there's bond money. So I don't see any one big source, but I do think that we can creatively pull together resources, not just funding, but resources from various areas. And you know, you look at what Google Ocean has done, and there's a real interest in the private sector in this. So to me, it's you know, it's this is a place. California is a place where innovation happens, and so I think we have that going for us as well. And actually, I think that, you know, we already have a lot of the information. It's just that it's scattered all over the place. It's maybe in the wrong form. I think it isn't as if we have to go out and collect a whole lot more information in order to really have some benefit by assembling it and making it available. So I think that especially since we have marine map, we have experience with spatial planning now, I think as Mary said, we're a lot farther ahead. And so I don't think the entry cost is going to be quite so high.
All right. Well, first of all, I hope it's clear now, I think it is, how fortunate we've been to have these three particular individuals come and share their insights into the MLPA and the marine spatial planning processes. So I want to first thank these guys for coming out of their way and participating in the seminar series.